What would you do if the person who promised to love you forever deliberately left you to die in the depths of a remote forest? For Rebecca Winters, this unimaginable nightmare became reality when a peaceful anniversary getaway turned into a desperate fight for survival. But what happened next would not only save her life, it would change everything she thought she knew about trust, loyalty, and the extraordinary bond between humans and animals. Rebecca brushed a strand of auburn hair from her face, squinting at the rugged trail map spread across her knees. The gentle rocking of their SUV had nearly lulled her to sleep, but the growing roughness of the terrain kept jolting her awake. Outside the passenger window, the pine trees grew increasingly dense, blocking out more and more sunlight as they drove deeper into the Cascade Mountain wilderness. "Are you sure this is the right way, Mark?" she asked, glancing at her husband of 5 years. "We haven't seen another vehicle for at least 40 minutes. Mark Winters kept his eyes fixed on the narrow dirt road ahead, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "It's supposed to be remote, Beck. That's the whole point of an anniversary getaway, isn't it? Just you, me, and nobody else for miles." Rebecca nodded slowly, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling settling in her stomach. Something about Mark had been different lately. Distant, secretive, checking his phone when he thought she wasn't looking. She'd hoped this trip would help them reconnect, reignite the spark that had been fading for months. But the further they drove into the wilderness, the more she wondered if she'd made a mistake. "The cabin should be just a few more miles in," Mark said, his voice oddly flat. "According to the rental listing, it's completely off-grid. Solar power, well water, the works, perfect for getting away from everything." Rebecca managed a smile, though her heart wasn't in it. As a veteran army nurse who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, she was no stranger to challenging environments. The isolation didn't bother her. She'd even been looking forward to it. What bothered her was the growing sense that Mark was hiding something. The SUV bounced harshly over a fallen branch, sending the trail map tumbling from Rebecca's lap. As she reached down to retrieve it, her fingers brushed against something unexpected under her seat. Curious, she pulled it out, a small velvet box, the kind that typically held jewelry. Her heart lifted momentarily. Was this why Mark had been acting strange? Had he planned a surprise gift for their anniversary? She almost opened the box, but hesitated, not wanting to ruin whatever surprise he had planned. Instead, she quietly slipped it back under the seat, feeling a renewed sense of hope. Maybe everything was fine after all. Half an hour later, Mark parked the SUV in a small clearing beside what could barely be called a cabin. It was more of a rustic shack, weathered grey wood with a small porch and a single window facing the dense forest. It didn't match the charming photos from the rental website, but Rebecca reminded herself that they were here for the experience, not luxury accommodations. "Home sweet home," Mark announced, cutting the engine, "at least for the next 4 days." Rebecca stepped out of the vehicle, stretching her legs after the long drive. Despite her lingering concerns, the forest's natural beauty took her breath away. Towering pines reached skyward, dappled sunlight filtering through their branches. The air smelled of earth and pine needles, crisp and clean, in a way city air never could be. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of running water, a stream perhaps. Mark circled to the back of the SUV and began unloading their supplies. "Can you grab your own backpack? It's heavy with all that extra water you insisted on bringing." Rebecca smiled, heading to the rear of the vehicle. Better to be over-prepared than under-prepared. That's what the army taught me. As she helped unload their gear, Rebecca couldn't help but notice that Mark had packed unusually light for himself. Just one small duffel bag compared to the supplies he'd insisted she bring. But before she could question him, a sound from the surrounding forest caught her attention, a low growl, followed by rustling in the underbrush about 20 yards away. She froze, scanning the tree line. "Did you hear that?" Mark shrugged, not bothering. A look up from the bags. "Probably just a raccoon or something. Don't worry about it." The rustling grew louder, and Rebecca tensed, her military training kicking in as she assessed potential threats. Then, from between two dense pine trees, a large German shepherd emerged, its amber eyes fixed intently on them. "Mark," Rebecca whispered urgently, "there's a dog here." Mark finally glanced up, his expression hardening when he spotted the animal. "It's probably feral. Just ignore it, and it'll go away." But the dog didn't look feral to Rebecca. Despite its cautious stance, its coat appeared relatively clean and well-kept, not matted or unkempt as she would expect from a truly wild animal. Around its neck, she could just make out what appeared to be a weathered, faded collar, though no tags were visible from this distance. The German shepherd watched them for several long moments, ears perked forward attentively. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared back into the forest as silently as it had appeared. "See? Nothing to worry about," Mark said dismissively, handing Rebecca her heavily packed backpack. "Let's get set up before it gets dark." The interior of the cabin was as sparse as its exterior suggested. One main room with a small kitchenette, a rickety table with two chairs, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. A door in the back presumably led to a bathroom, though Rebecca suspected it would be as rudimentary as the rest of the place. As she unpacked their supplies, Rebecca noticed Mark checking his phone repeatedly, scowling at the lack of signal. His agitation seemed to grow with each passing minute. When she suggested they take a short hike before sunset to explore the surrounding area, he refused, claiming he needed to rest after the long drive. "I thought the whole point of coming out here was to disconnect and spend time together," Rebecca said, unable to keep the disappointment from her voice. "We have 4 days," Mark replied tersely. "There's plenty of time for hiking later." That night they ate a simple dinner of canned soup heated on the cabin's small propane stove. The conversation was stilted, with long stretches of uncomfortable silence. Mark barely touched his food, instead nursing a flask of whiskey he'd brought along. Rebecca had never seen him drink so heavily before, and it only added to her growing unease. As darkness fell outside, the forest came alive with sounds, the hooting of owls, the rustle of nocturnal creatures moving through the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the pines. Under different circumstances, Rebecca might have found it peaceful, even romantic. Instead, trapped in the tense silence with an increasingly distant husband, the sounds only heightened her sense of isolation. She woke in the middle of the night to find Mark's side of the bed empty. Groggy and disoriented, she sat up, peering through the darkness. A sliver of moonlight through the single window revealed Mark standing by the cabin door, fully dressed, his duffel bag at his feet. "Mark," she called softly, "what are you doing?" He stiffened, but didn't turn to face her. "Go back to sleep, Rebecca." Something in his voice sent a chill down her spine. Fully awake now, she switched on the battery-powered lantern beside the bed. "Where are you going in the middle of the night?" Mark finally turned, and what she saw in his face made her blood run cold. His expression held none of the warmth or affection she'd grown accustomed to over their years together. Instead, his eyes were cold, calculating, fixed on her with an unsettling detachment that made him almost unrecognizable. "This isn't working anymore," he said flatly. "It hasn't been for a long time." Rebecca stood, confusion mixing with growing alarm. "What are you talking about? If you're unhappy, we can talk about it, work through it." "There's nothing to work through," Mark interrupted. "I've met someone else. She understands me in ways you never could." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. "You... what? You've been cheating on me. For how long?" Mark's expression remained impassive. "Does it matter? It's been long enough to know that she's who I want to be with, not you." Rebecca's mind raced, pieces suddenly falling into place. The secretive phone checks, the emotional distance, the reluctance to spend time with her. But something still didn't make sense. Then why bring me all the way out here? Why not just tell me at home? Her voice cracked slightly, but she fought to maintain her composure. Years of crisis management in combat zones helping her stay focused, despite the emotional turmoil. Mark picked up his duffel bag, slinging it over his shoulder. "Because this way is cleaner. No messy scenes, no mutual friends taking sides. By the time anyone realizes you're missing, I'll be long gone." Starting over. The implication of his words struck her with horrifying clarity. "You're leaving me here, in the middle of nowhere." Rebecca took a step toward him, disbelief warring with rising panic. "Mark, that's insane. We're miles from any road, any town." "You're the survival expert, aren't you?" Mark cut in, his voice cold. "Always bragging about your military training, how tough you are. Consider this a chance to put all that to use." Rebecca lunged forward, reaching for the cabin door, but Mark was faster. He shoved her backward, sending her crashing into the kitchenette. Pain flared in her hip as it connected with the hard edge of the counter. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Mark warned, his hand already on the doorknob. "Your backpack has some supplies. That's more than most people would get in your situation." "Mark, please," Rebecca pleaded, desperation creeping into her voice. "You don't have to do this. Whatever's happening between us, we can figure it out. Just don't leave me here alone." For a brief moment, something flickered across his face, hesitation, perhaps even a glimmer of remorse. But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by cold determination. "Goodbye, Rebecca," he said, opening the door. The night air rushed in, carrying with it the sounds of the forest, suddenly more threatening than peaceful. Rebecca scrambled to her feet, ignoring the pain in her hip as she lunged for the door. Again, Mark stepped outside, then turned to face her one last time. "I wouldn't bother trying to follow me. You never could navigate without GPS, and I've made sure your phone won't help you." He held up her smartphone, which he must have taken while she slept, then casually tossed it against a nearby rock. The screen shattered instantly, the device going dark. "You won't get away with this," Rebecca said, her shock giving way to anger. "People will look for me. They'll figure out what you've done." Mark's laugh was cold and hollow. "Who?" "Your army. Friends are all deployed or scattered across the country. Your parents are dead. Your sister thinks you're on a romantic getaway, and I've already sent texts from your phone saying we're extending our trip another week. By the time anyone wonders where you are, there won't be anything left to find." With that chilling statement, he turned and walked toward the SUV, leaving Rebecca frozen in the doorway. The devastating reality of her situation sinking in. She was alone, miles from civilization, with minimal supplies, no transportation, and no means of communication. As the engine roared to life and headlights cut through the darkness, Rebecca's military training kicked in. Survival now. Feelings later. She rushed back inside, grabbing her backpack to inventory what resources she had. But when she unzipped it, her heart sank. The pack contained only a single water bottle, a small bag of trail mix, and a thin blanket. All the careful supplies she had packed, the first aid kit, the multi-tool, the extra water, had been removed. Outside, the SUV's tires spun in the dirt as Mark accelerated away, the vehicle's lights quickly swallowed by the dense forest. The retreating sound of the engine faded, leaving Rebecca in a silence so complete it seemed to press against her eardrums. She sank to the cabin floor, shock and disbelief threatening to overwhelm her. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the betrayal. Not just the infidelity, but the calculated cruelty of abandoning her in the wilderness, with the clear intention that she wouldn't survive to tell anyone what he had done. Then, from somewhere in the darkness outside, she heard it. A low, rumbling growl, followed by the distinct sound of paws padding across the ground near the cabin. The German Shepherd had returned, but whether its presence represented an additional threat or an unexpected ally remained to be seen. Through the open doorway, illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the trees, a pair of amber eyes stared back at her. The dog's powerful silhouette stood like a sentinel in the night, watching, waiting. And in that moment, despite everything, Rebecca felt the faintest flicker of something she thought had left with Mark's retreating tail lights. Hope. Rebecca's heart pounded against her ribs as she stared into the German Shepherd's amber eyes. The dog stood motionless at the threshold of the cabin, its powerful frame silhouetted against the moonlit forest. She remembered her training. Make yourself big. Don't show fear. Back away slowly. But something about the animal's demeanor gave her pause. It wasn't displaying aggression. It wasn't baring its teeth or growling. It simply watched her with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "Hey there," Rebecca said softly, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor of adrenaline coursing through her body. "Are you lost too?" The dog's ears perked forward at the sound of her voice. It took a tentative step into the cabin, then another, its nails clicking against the wooden floor. Rebecca remained perfectly still, scarcely breathing as the German Shepherd approached. Up close, she could see details she'd missed earlier. The dog was a male, well-muscled but leaner than he should be, suggesting he'd been on his own for a while. His coat was predominantly black with tan markings on his face, chest and legs. Classic German Shepherd coloring. And around his neck was indeed a collar, though weathered and frayed, with a small tarnished metal tag hanging from it. Slowly, telegraph her movements, Rebecca extended her hand, palm down, allowing the dog to sniff her. "It's okay," she murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you." The German Shepherd sniffed her hand thoroughly, then, to her surprise, sat down directly in front of her, his posture alert but relaxed. With trembling fingers, Rebecca reached for the tag on his collar, turning it to catch the meager moonlight. Filtering through the cabin window, "Ranger," she read aloud, "is that your name, boy?" At the sound of his name, the dog's tail swept once across the floor. The tag revealed no address or phone number, just a single word stamped beneath the name: "Veteran." "A military working dog," Rebecca whispered, a new understanding dawning. No wonder the animal seemed so disciplined, so purposeful in his movements. But what was he doing out here in the wilderness, miles from any military installation? The realization that she wasn't completely alone brought a fresh wave of emotions crashing over Rebecca. The shock of Mark's betrayal, the terror of her situation, the uncertainty of survival. It all hit her at once, and she buried her face in her hands, unable to hold back the tears any longer. To her astonishment, she felt something warm and solid, a press against her side. Ranger had moved closer, leaning his weight gently against her in a gesture that could only be described as comforting. Rebecca instinctively wrapped an arm around the dog's broad shoulders, drawing strength from his steady presence. "Thank you," she whispered into his fur. "At least now I'm not alone." For several minutes, they remained like that, a broken-hearted woman and a lost military dog, finding unexpected solace in each other's company. Then, as if sensing that the moment of vulnerability had passed, Ranger pulled away and moved toward the open cabin door, looking back at her expectantly. Rebecca wiped her eyes, the survival instincts forged during her military service reasserting themselves. Crying wouldn't keep her alive. Action would. She needed to take stock of her situation, assess her resources, and develop a plan. First priority, secure shelter for the night. Rebecca closed and latched the cabin door, though she knew it wouldn't keep out determined wildlife or her treacherous husband, should he decide to return and ensure she wouldn't survive to tell her story. She searched the cabin methodically, hoping Mark might have overlooked something useful. The kitchenette yielded a single pot, a dented can of beans hidden behind the small propane stove, and a book of matches. In the tiny bathroom, she found half a roll of toilet paper and a cracked bar of soap. Not much, but better than nothing. The bed had sheets and a thin blanket that she could take if she needed to leave the cabin. Rebecca returned to her backpack, emptying its contents completely to confirm what she already knew. One water bottle nearly full, a small bag of trail mix, mostly nuts and dried fruit, a thin emergency blanket made of reflective material, and tucked into a side pocket she hadn't checked before, a small first aid kit containing basic bandages, antiseptic wipes, and a few packets of pain relievers. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough for a prolonged survival situation, but it was something to start with. Next priority, determine her location and possible routes to civilization. Without her phone or a map, this would be challenging. She tried to recall details. From the drive-in, how long had they traveled on that dirt road? 2 hours? 3? At what point had they turned off the main highway? Her mental map was frustratingly vague. Ranger had settled near the door, his head on his paws, but his eyes remaining alert, following her movements around the cabin. As Rebecca paced, trying to formulate a plan, the dog suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked forward toward the window. "What is it, boy?" Rebecca whispered, moving cautiously to peer outside. In the clearing illuminated by moonlight, a deer and her fawn had emerged from the forest, cautiously approaching the cabin. Rebecca watched, momentarily distracted from her dire situation by the peaceful scene. The mother deer raised her head, sniffing the air cautiously, while the spotted fawn stayed close to her side. Then, without warning, both deer tensed, white tails rising in alarm as they bounded back into the cover of the trees. Something had spooked them, something they had sensed before Rebecca or even Ranger had detected it. Seconds later, she heard what had frightened the deer, the low, rumbling growl of an engine. Headlights appeared between the trees, cutting through the darkness of the forest night. Mark's SUV was returning. Rebecca's blood ran cold. Why would he come back? Had he forgotten something? Or had he decided that abandoning her wasn't enough, that he needed to ensure she would never be found? Ranger was on his feet now, a low growl building in his throat as he stared at the door. Rebecca quickly gathered her few supplies, shoving them back into the backpack. She had seconds to decide: hide inside the cabin or flee into the forest. The SUV's headlights swept across the cabin windows as it pulled into the clearing. The engine died, and in the sudden silence, Rebecca could hear the creak of the driver's door opening, followed by heavy footsteps on the gravel outside. "Hide," Rebecca hissed to Ranger, though she doubted the trained military dog needed the command. She extinguished the lantern and pressed herself against the wall beside the door, heart hammering so loudly she was certain it could be heard through the thin wooden walls. The footsteps approached the cabin deliberately, unhurried. A key rattled in the lock. Of course, Mark would have kept a key, and the door swung open slowly, moonlight spilling across the threshold. Mark stood silhouetted in the doorway, his face in shadow. "Rebecca," he called softly, his voice deceptively gentle. "I came back to talk. I made a mistake." Rebecca held her breath, every muscle tense. She didn't believe him for a second. People who made mistakes didn't meticulously sabotage their spouse's survival gear before abandoning them in the wilderness. Mark took a step into the cabin, reaching for the light switch that Rebecca knew wouldn't work. The cabin had no electricity. "Rebecca, I know you're in here. Your backpack is gone from the SUV. I just want to talk." As he moved further into the cabin, Rebecca could finally see his face in the moonlight streaming through the window. His expression wasn't apologetic or remorseful. It was cold, calculating, with a determination that sent ice through her veins. In his right hand, partially concealed by his side, was something that glinted metallically in the dim light, a hunting knife. He had returned to finish what he'd started. In that moment of horrible clarity, Ranger erupted from the shadows beside. The bed, a streak of black and tan fury, launching himself at Mark with a ferocity that startled even Rebecca. She'd seen military working dogs in action during her deployment, but nothing prepared her for the primal intensity of Ranger's attack. Mark screamed, the knife clattering to the floor as he raised his arms defensively. Ranger didn't bite. Not yet, but he had Mark pinned against the wall, powerful jaws snapping inches from the man's throat, giving Rebecca the opening she needed. She snatched up her backpack and bolted for the door, pausing only long enough to grab Mark's fallen knife from the floor. Outside, the keys still dangled from the ignition of the SUV. Freedom was just steps away. But Rebecca hesitated, looking back at the cabin door. Ranger was still inside with Mark, and the sounds of struggle echoed through the night air. She couldn't leave the dog behind, not when he had just saved her life. "Ranger!" she called sharply, using the commanding tone she'd heard military dog handlers use during training exercises. "Come!" For a heart-stopping moment, she feared the dog wouldn't respond to her command. Then Ranger backed away from Mark, still growling, but no longer attacking, and raced through the door to her side. Mark appeared in the doorway, blood streaming from scratches on his face and arms. "You bitch!" he snarled, his pretense of reconciliation completely abandoned. "You and that mutt won't survive a day out here." Rebecca didn't waste breath responding. She ran for the SUV, Ranger at her heels, and yanked open the driver's door. The dog leapt into the passenger seat as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. Mark realized her intention too late. He lunged across the clearing toward the vehicle, but Rebecca had already turned the key. The engine roared to life. Tires spinning in the dirt as she accelerated away from the cabin. In the rearview mirror, she could see Mark standing in the glow of the taillights, his figure growing smaller as she put distance between them. He had no vehicle now, no easy way out of the wilderness. The irony wasn't lost on her. He had intended to leave her stranded, and now he was the one trapped in the forest. But her moment of triumph was short-lived. After less than half a mile, the rough forest road narrowed dramatically, becoming little more than a game trail choked with undergrowth. The SUV couldn't go any further without risking damage that would leave it unusable. Rebecca slowed to a stop, weighing her options. She could turn around, try to find the main road they'd come in on, but that would mean going back past the cabin, past Mark. And in the darkness, with no map and only her vague memories of the drive, she could easily get lost on the maze of logging roads and fire breaks that crisscrossed the national forest. Beside her, Ranger whined softly, pressing his nose against the window, looking into the darkness beyond. It was almost as if he was suggesting a different path. "What do you think, boy?" Rebecca asked, reaching over to scratch behind his ears. "Got a better idea?" In response, Ranger pawed at the door handle, clearly wanting out. Rebecca sighed, then nodded. "All right. We'll ditch the car here. If we keep moving through the night, we can put some serious distance between us and Mark before sunrise." She turned off the engine but left the keys in the ignition. Let Mark find the vehicle if he could. By then, she planned to be miles away. She took a moment to search the SUV thoroughly, hoping to find anything useful Mark might have left behind. The glove compartment yielded a small flashlight with fading batteries, a crumpled map that appeared to be of an entirely different region, and a lighter, a significant find that could mean the difference between survival and death if she needed to make a fire. Under the driver's seat, her fingers brushed against something familiar, the velvet jewelry box she'd discovered earlier. She pulled it out, curious despite the urgency of her situation. Inside wasn't jewelry as she'd expected, but a small key labeled storage unit number 237. Another piece of Mark's exit strategy, perhaps. A place where he'd stashed money or supplies for his new life. Rebecca pocketed the key, though she had no idea where this storage unit might be located. If she survived, when she survived, she corrected herself firmly. It might provide evidence of premeditation for the police. Slinging her slightly heavier backpack over her shoulders, Rebecca opened the door and stepped out into the forest night. Ranger jumped out after her, shaking himself as if relieved to be free of the confines of the vehicle. "All right, Ranger," she said, clicking on the flashlight and sweeping its feeble beam across the dense undergrowth surrounding them. "Which way?" To her amazement, the German Shepherd immediately set off along a narrow animal trail, leading away from both the road and the direction of the cabin. His movements were purposeful, pausing occasionally to look back and ensure she was following. Rebecca hesitated only briefly before falling in behind him. A trained military dog might have better instincts in this wilderness than she did. And right now, any direction that took her away from Mark was the right one. As they pushed deeper into the forest, the full moon occasionally broke through gaps in the canopy, casting silver light on their path. The night was alive with sounds. The rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant hooting of an owl, the whisper of wind through the pine needles overhead. Under different circumstances, Rebecca might have found it peaceful, even beautiful. But with each step taking her, further from civilization and deeper into the wilderness, with only a strange dog and a few meager supplies standing between her and death. The night sounds took on a more sinister quality. Every snapping twig could be Mark pursuing them. Every shadow could hide predators, both animal and human. Yet, beneath the fear and uncertainty, Rebecca felt something else stirring, a sense of her own strength returning. She had survived war zones. She had treated wounded soldiers under enemy fire. She had endured loss and pain and come out stronger. She would survive this too. And somewhat miraculously, she wasn't alone. She glanced at Ranger's powerful form moving confidently through the darkness ahead of her, and for the first time since Mark had revealed his true nature, Rebecca allowed herself to feel a flicker of genuine hope. Whatever lay ahead in the vast wilderness, they would face it together. The first streaks of dawn filtered through the dense canopy of pine trees, casting dappled light on the forest floor. Rebecca had lost track of how long they'd been walking. Hours had blended together in a haze of exhaustion and determination, her legs moving mechanically, following Ranger's unwavering lead through the darkness. They had traveled primarily downhill, which Rebecca knew was generally the best strategy for finding water and eventually civilization. The German Shepherd moved with purpose, occasionally circling back to check on her when she lagged behind, his amber eyes reflecting her flashlight beam like twin flames in the darkness. Now, as the forest gradually awakened around them, Rebecca finally allowed herself to stop. Her muscles screamed in protest as she sank onto a fallen log, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She unscrewed her water bottle with trembling hands and allowed herself a small sip, then poured a little into her cupped palm for Ranger. The dog lapped the water gratefully, then sat at attention beside her, his ears perked forward, constantly scanning their surroundings. No ordinary stray would behave with such discipline, such awareness. Rebecca was increasingly convinced that Ranger was indeed a military working dog, perhaps one who had been separated from his handler during a training exercise in these mountains, or who had somehow escaped during transport between bases. "How long have you been out here alone, boy?" she murmured, reaching out to stroke his thick fur. Despite his lean condition, his coat was surprisingly clean and free of burrs or mats, suggesting he hadn't been living wild for very long. Or perhaps he was simply exceptional at taking care of himself. Rebecca took stock of their situation as the forest brightened around them. The immediate danger from Mark had subsided. She didn't think he could have followed their trail in the darkness, especially without a vehicle. But her situation remained dire. She had limited supplies, no clear idea of her location, and no way to communicate with the outside world. Her military training had included wilderness survival basics, but she was far from an expert. First priority, find water. The small bottle she carried wouldn't last long, especially if she was sharing with Ranger. The downward trajectory of their night journey suggested they might be heading toward a valley where streams or rivers were more likely to be found. As if reading her thoughts, Ranger stood and stretched, then began moving again, glancing back at her expectantly. Rebecca forced her aching body to rise, wincing at the blisters forming on her heels. She had been wearing casual hiking boots that were comfortable enough for short trails, but not designed for the kind of extended wilderness trek she was now undertaking. "Lead on," she told the dog wearily, adjusting her backpack straps. They continued their descent through the forest for another hour. The terrain gradually changed, with the pine trees giving way to more diverse vegetation. Maples, aspens, and dense undergrowth that made navigation increasingly difficult. Rebecca had to push through tangled bushes that caught at her clothing, leaving small scratches on her exposed arms. Ranger, with his lower profile and agile body, had an easier time, though he often paused to ensure she was still following. The sound reached her ears before she saw it, a faint rushing noise that gradually grew louder as they progressed. Water. Rebecca's pace quickened despite her fatigue, hope giving her a second wind. Ranger seemed equally energized, moving faster through the underbrush, occasionally looking back at her with what she could swear was encouragement in his intelligent eyes. They broke through a final stand of trees and found themselves at the edge of a small but vigorous stream, its clear water tumbling over smooth rocks. Rebecca nearly cried with relief. She dropped to her knees beside the water, plunging her hands into the cold current. After checking that there was no obvious contamination upstream, she drank deeply, the icy water soothing her parched throat. Ranger lapped eagerly at the stream, his tail wagging for the first time since they'd met. After they both had their fill, Rebecca refilled her water bottle, wishing she had some way to purify the water, but knowing that in her current situation, the risk of waterborne illness was far less immediate than the risk of dehydration. With their most pressing need addressed, Rebecca assessed their next steps. The stream was a valuable resource, not just for water but as a potential path to follow. Moving downstream would eventually lead to larger bodies of water, which often meant human settlements or at least roads that followed the waterways. "What do you think, Ranger? Should we follow the stream?" she asked, unsure why she kept talking to the dog as if he could understand her complex thoughts, yet finding comfort in voicing her plans aloud. Ranger, who had been sniffing along the stream bank, suddenly tensed. His ears flattened against his head, and a low growl rumbled from his chest. Rebecca froze, her senses immediately on high alert. "What is it?" she whispered, slowly rising to her feet and scanning their surroundings. The answer came in the form of a large black shape moving through the trees on the opposite bank of the stream. A bear, its massive body partially obscured by the underbrush, but unmistakable in its size and powerful movements. It hadn't noticed them yet, focused on something along the water's edge, about 50 yards downstream. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew the general guidance for bear encounters. Don't run, make yourself look big, back away slowly, but actually putting that into practice with a real bear just across a narrow stream was entirely different. Ranger's growl deepened, his body coiled with tension beside her. "Shh," she whispered, placing a cautioning hand on the dog's back. "Easy, boy." The last thing they needed was for Ranger to challenge the bear. Even a trained military dog would be no match for hundreds of pounds of wild predator. Rebecca began backing away slowly, tugging gently on Ranger's collar to urge him to retreat with her. The dog complied reluctantly, his gaze never leaving the bear. They had almost reached the tree line when a sound behind them, a snapping twig beneath Rebecca's foot, caused the bear to raise its massive head. For an agonizing moment, their eyes met across the stream, the bear's small, dark eyes widening with awareness of their presence. Rebecca held her breath. The bear rose slightly on its hind legs, sniffing the air, then dropped back to all fours. To her immense relief, instead of approaching, it turned and lumbered away into the forest, apparently deciding they weren't worth the trouble. Only when the bear had completely disappeared did Rebecca allow herself to exhale. "That was close," she murmured, her voice shaky. Ranger's posture gradually relaxed, though he remained vigilant, scanning the area where the bear had vanished. The encounter was a stark reminder of just how dangerous her situation was. She wasn't just dealing with exposure, dehydration, and hunger. She was in a wilderness filled with predators that could end her life in moments. And somewhere behind her was perhaps the most dangerous predator of all, a man who had deliberately left her to die, and who might still be hunting her. They needed to keep moving. Rebecca decided to follow the stream, but at a safe distance from the banks, where they would have a better view of any wildlife approaching the water. She estimated it was mid-morning now, giving them several hours of daylight to make progress before she would need to consider finding shelter for the night. As they walked, the forest began to feel less oppressive, opening up in places to allow broader shafts of sunlight to penetrate the canopy. The stream widened gradually, suggesting they were indeed heading in the right direction, downstream toward larger waterways. Rebecca's stomach growled painfully, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since their meager dinner the previous evening. She paused to retrieve the small bag of trail mix from her backpack, rationing out a handful for herself and a few pieces for Ranger, who accepted the offering with surprising gentleness. "Not exactly a balanced diet for either of us," she told him, watching as he crunched a peanut, "but it'll have to do for now." As they continued their journey, Rebecca found herself talking more to Ranger, the sound of her own voice helping to combat the isolation and maintain her focus. She told him about her military service, about the wounded soldiers she had treated in field hospitals, about the bonds she had formed with her fellow nurses and doctors in the crucible of war. "I thought nothing could be harder than that," she admitted as they navigated around a fallen tree blocking their path. Seeing young men and women torn apart by IEDs, trying to hold them together with inadequate supplies and too little time. But at least there, I knew what I was fighting against. I knew who to trust. Her voice caught on the last word, the betrayal still raw and bleeding in her chest. She had trusted Mark completely, had built a life with him, had planned a future. How could she have missed the darkness lurking behind his smile? How could she have been so blind? Ranger nudged her hand with his nose, as if sensing her distress, his warm presence, a silent comfort. Rebecca scratched behind his ears gratefully. "At least I can trust you, right boy, though I still don't understand why you're helping me." The mystery of Ranger's presence in these woods and his apparent decision to assist her remained unsolved, but Rebecca was too grateful for his companionship to question it deeply. Whether by training, instinct, or some deeper connection she couldn't explain, the German shepherd had appointed himself her protector, and she wasn't about to refuse the help. As the day wore on, Rebecca noticed Ranger's attention shifting, his nose working overtime as he detected scents imperceptible to her human senses. He began moving with renewed purpose, occasionally ranging ahead before circling back to ensure she was following. Something had caught his interest. "What is it, Ranger? What do you smell?" she asked, pushing aside her exhaustion to quicken her pace. The dog led her away from the stream, angling up a gentle slope covered with ferns and low-growing shrubs. At the crest of the rise, Rebecca stopped short, hardly believing what she was seeing. Nestled in a small clearing, partially hidden by the surrounding vegetation, stood a dilapidated cabin, not the one Mark had brought her to, but an older structure, its logs weathered silver by years of exposure. A hunter's cabin, perhaps, or an old Forest Service outpost, long abandoned by the look of the sagging roof and the vegetation growing up around its foundation. "Good boy, Ranger," Rebecca breathed, amazed once again by the dog's seemingly uncanny ability to find exactly what they needed. "Good job." They approached cautiously, Rebecca alert for any signs of recent habitation. The door hung partially open on rusted hinges, suggesting no one had secured the place in years. Ranger entered first, his body language relaxed as he systematically checked the small interior, then returned to the doorway with a soft whine that Rebecca interpreted as an all clear. The cabin was a single room with a stone fireplace, a crude wooden table with one remaining chair, and the rotted remnants of what had once been a cot against the far wall. The roof had several holes where daylight streamed through, but much of the structure remained sound. More importantly, it offered protection from the elements and would be far safer than spending the night in the open. Rebecca set down her backpack and began a methodical search of the cabin, hoping to find anything useful left behind by previous occupants. A rusted tin box yielded a handful of misshapen fishing hooks and a spool of line, potentially valuable for catching food if they stayed near the stream. In a corner cupboard, she discovered 2 sealed jars of home-canned food with labels too faded to read, but which appeared intact, and an ancient can of beans. Under a loose floorboard, revealed by Ranger's curious sniffing, she found a hunting knife in surprisingly good condition, its blade still sharp beneath a light coating of rust. Each item represented a significant improvement in their chances of survival. But the most valuable discovery came when Rebecca examined the stone fireplace. Behind a loose brick in the chimney, someone had stashed an emergency kit containing waterproof matches, a compact first aid kit with antibiotics that hadn't yet expired, and, most precious of all, a detailed topographical map of the region. Rebecca spread the map across the dusty table, trying to orient herself. Without knowing exactly where Mark's rental cabin had been located, it was difficult to pinpoint their current position, but the map showed several promising features: a ranger station about 15 miles southeast, and a well-traveled hiking trail approximately 7 miles east that eventually connected with a state highway. For the first time since Mark had revealed his true nature, Rebecca felt something like control returning. They had shelter, a few supplies, and most importantly, a direction to head in the morning. Outside, the light was beginning to fade as afternoon gave way to evening. Rebecca gathered some relatively dry wood from around the cabin and set about, building a small fire in the fireplace. The flames caught quickly, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls and providing both warmth and a much-needed psychological boost. Ranger settled on the floor near the fireplace, his head on his paws, but his eyes alert, still guarding even in rest. Rebecca sat beside him, running her fingers through his thick fur as she stared into the flames, planning their next steps. They would rest tonight, save their strength. In the morning, they would head for the hiking trail shown on the map. If they could reach it by nightfall tomorrow, they might encounter other hikers who could help them. If not, the trail itself would eventually lead to civilization. As darkness fell outside, the fire's warm glow and Ranger's steady presence beside her created an island of comfort in a sea of danger. Rebecca leaned back against the cabin wall, allowing her exhausted body to relax slightly. They were still deep in the wilderness, still faced numerous threats, but they were no longer completely helpless. "We're going to make it," she told Ranger, who lifted his head at the sound of her voice, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight. "And when we do, I'm going to make sure Mark pays for what he did. I promise you that." The German shepherd huffed softly, as if in agreement, then returned to his vigilant rest. Together, they waited for dawn and the next stage of their journey through the deep forest. Rebecca woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Thin rays of morning light filtered through the cabin's holes and cracks, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The fire had burned down to embers during the night, casting a faint orange glow across the weathered floorboards. For a split second, panic seized her. Where was Ranger? A soft whine from the doorway answered her unspoken question. The German shepherd stood at the partially open door, looking back at her expectantly, clearly eager to begin their day's journey. Rebecca exhaled with relief, pushing herself up from her makeshift bed on the floor. Every muscle in her body protested the movement, stiff from yesterday's long trek and the hard wooden surface she'd slept on. "Morning, boy," she said, her voice rough with sleep. "Ready to get moving, I see." She checked her watch, 6:47 a.m., early enough to make significant progress before the heat of the day set in. Rebecca quickly inventoried their supplies, organizing everything for efficient travel. The map she'd found was carefully folded and tucked into her pocket for easy access. She had decided to follow the old hunting cabin's faint trail eastward, hoping it would eventually connect with the marked hiking path shown on the map. After a small breakfast of trail mix and water, Rebecca extinguished the remaining embers. With dirt from outside, she didn't want to risk a forest fire, even from their small, contained blaze. As an afterthought, she used a charred stick to scratch a message on the cabin wall. "Rebecca Winters passed through, heading east to Maine. Trail. Husband Mark tried to kill me." She added the date and an arrow pointing east. If anyone found the cabin after her, they might see her message and understand what had happened. The morning air was crisp and cool as they set out, a welcome change from yesterday's humid heat. Ranger took the lead again, his nose working constantly, as he picked his way along what might once have been a proper trail, but had long since been reclaimed by nature. Rebecca followed, her movements more confident than the day before. Having a map and a clear destination had renewed her determination. "We've got about 7 miles to cover today," she told Ranger as they walked. "If we maintain a steady pace, we should reach the hiking trail by late afternoon." Of course, she knew that 7 miles in wilderness terrain was very different from 7 miles on flat, even ground. The landscape around them was a jumble of ridges and valleys, with numerous obstacles, fallen trees, dense thickets, rocky outcroppings that would slow their progress. But she had faced worse challenges during her military training. This was just another mission, with survival as the objective. As the sun climbed higher, the forest came alive around them. Birds called from the canopy overhead, squirrels chattered indignantly as they passed, and once they spotted a fox slipping silently through the undergrowth, its russet coat flashing. Briefly before it disappeared, Rebecca found herself appreciating the beauty of her surroundings, despite the circumstances. There was something profoundly peaceful about these ancient woods, untouched by human development. By midday, the terrain had become increasingly difficult. The faint trail they'd been following disappeared entirely, forcing them to navigate by compass direction alone. They encountered a series of steep ridges that required careful climbing, with Ranger somehow always finding the easiest path up, then waiting patiently for Rebecca to follow. During a brief rest at the top of a particularly challenging slope, Rebecca studied the map again. Based on the topographical features around them, she estimated they had covered perhaps 3 miles. Not as much as she'd hoped, but still decent progress given the difficult terrain. As she tucked the map away, a distant sound caught her attention. A mechanical noise that seemed jarringly out of place in the wilderness. She froze, listening intently. There it was again, the distinct rumble of an engine, somewhere to the west of their position. "Mark?" she whispered, her heart rate accelerating. Had he somehow found the SUV and managed to get it running again? Was he searching for her? Ranger's ears were pricked forward, his body tense as he also detected the sound. But rather than appearing alarmed, he seemed almost eager, taking a few steps in the direction of the noise before looking back at Rebecca. "I don't think we should go that way, boy," she said uncertainly. "If it's Mark." The sound faded, then returned slightly louder. It wasn't the deep rumble of an SUV engine, Rebecca realized, but something higher pitched, perhaps an ATV or dirt bike. Rangers and Forest Service personnel sometimes used such vehicles to patrol remote areas. It could be help, or it could be Mark, who might have found alternative transportation while searching for her. Rebecca weighed her options. Continuing, east as planned would eventually bring them to the hiking trail, which represented their safest route to civilization. But if the mechanical sounds represented park rangers or Forest Service workers, seeking them out could drastically shorten their ordeal. Ranger seemed to have made his own decision. He barked once, the first time Rebecca had heard him make such a direct vocalization, and began moving purposefully toward the sound, pausing after a few yards to ensure she was following. "You think we should check it out?" Rebecca asked, still hesitant. Ranger's response was to bark again, more insistently. Something about the dog's confidence swayed her. Throughout their journey, his instincts had proven remarkably accurate. If he believed they should investigate the sound, perhaps she should trust him. "All right," she conceded, "but we approach carefully. At the first sign of danger, we retreat." "Understood?" Ranger wagged his tail once, then led her westward, moving with increased urgency. The mechanical sounds grew gradually louder as they progressed, though they remained intermittent. Rebecca moved with heightened caution, stopping frequently to listen and check for any signs of danger. After half an hour of careful advance, Ranger suddenly stopped at the edge of a small clearing. He dropped into a crouch, signaling Rebecca to do the same. She complied immediately, her military training kicking in as she crawled forward to peer through the underbrush. The clearing contained a small cabin, much newer and better maintained than the abandoned hunter's shelter they'd spent the night in. Parked beside it was a Forest Service ATV, its green paint distinctive against the browns and greens of the forest. A uniformed ranger was unloading supplies from the vehicle, seemingly unaware of their presence. Relief flooded through Rebecca so intensely that for a moment she felt lightheaded. Help, safety, a way out of this nightmare. But caution kept her from rushing forward immediately. What if Mark had somehow managed to alert authorities with his own version of events? What if he had reported her missing under suspicious circumstances, or worse, claimed she was dangerous or unstable? She observed the ranger for several minutes. He appeared to be a man in his 50s with graying hair, visible beneath his uniform hat. He moved with the unhurried confidence of someone familiar with the wilderness, methodically transferring equipment from the ATV to the cabin, likely a remote ranger station used for extended patrols. Finally, Rebecca made her decision. This represented their best chance at rescue, and she couldn't let fear of Mark's potential manipulations prevent her from taking it. She turned to Ranger, who was watching her intently, waiting for her cue. "Stay close to me," she whispered, stroking his head. "Let me do the talking." She emerged from the undergrowth slowly, hands visible, calling out as she approached. "Hello, Forest Service? I need help, please." The ranger spun around, startled by her voice. His hand moved instinctively to the radio at his belt, but he didn't appear immediately threatened, just surprised to encounter anyone this deep in the backcountry. "Mom," he called back, squinting at her. As she drew closer, his expression shifted from surprise to concern. Rebecca knew she must look terrible. Clothes torn and dirty, face scratched, hair tangled with twigs and leaves. "My name is Rebecca Winters," she said, stopping at a respectable distance. Ranger stayed obediently at her side, alert but non-threatening. "I've been lost in the forest for 2 days. My husband, he abandoned me at a remote cabin with no supplies. He tried to kill me." The ranger's face registered shock. Then a professional mask fell into place. "Are you injured, ma'am?" "Nothing serious. Dehydrated, hungry, exhausted." She gestured to Ranger. "This dog found me, led me through the forest. I think he's a military working dog who got separated from his handler." The ranger nodded, his gaze assessing both of them. "Why don't you come inside? I've got water, food, first aid supplies, and a radio to call this in." Rebecca followed him into the cabin, which was small but well equipped with basic necessities. The ranger, who introduced himself as Jim Hardin, 23 years with the Forest Service, provided water and energy bars, which Rebecca gratefully accepted. She shared some with Ranger, who remained vigilant even in these safer surroundings. As Rebecca recounted her ordeal, Ranger watched the ranger's every move, his training evident in his alert posture and attentive gaze. When Hardin reached for his radio, the dog tensed slightly until Rebecca reassured him with a gentle touch. "I need to report this immediately," Hardin said, extending the radio microphone. "This is Ranger Hardin at Northeast Station 6. I have a female survivor here. Says she was abandoned in the wilderness by her husband with intent to harm. Request immediate assistance and law enforcement contact." He listened to the response, then nodded. "Copy that. We'll secure the individual and stand by." He turned back to Rebecca. "Help is on the way. Sheriff's Department will meet us at the main ranger station. It's about 2 hours from here by ATV. Can you travel?" Rebecca nodded firmly. "I can travel, but Ranger comes with us." Hardin studied the German Shepherd thoughtfully. "That's definitely a military dog, possibly from the training facility about 60 miles north of here. They run exercises in these mountains sometimes. He must have gotten separated from his unit." He crouched down, extending his hand palm down in a proper greeting. "Hey there, boy." Ranger sniffed the offered hand cautiously, then relaxed, apparently deciding the ranger posed no threat. Hardin looked impressed. "He's bonded with you. That's unusual for these working dogs. They're typically handler exclusive." "He saved my life," Rebecca said simply, "multiple times. I don't know why he decided to help me, but I'm not leaving him behind." "No argument here," Hardin assured her. "We'll get him back to the training facility eventually, but for now, he stays with you. I've got some beef jerky that might make the ride more comfortable for him." As they prepared to leave, Rebecca felt a complex mix of emotions washing over her. Relief at being found, gratitude for Ranger's inexplicable assistance, anxiety about what lay ahead, the questions, the investigations, the inevitable confrontation with Mark's lies. But underneath it all was a steely determination. She had survived against the odds. She would see this through to the end. The ATV ride was uncomfortable, but infinitely preferable to continuing on foot. Rebecca sat behind Ranger Hardin, with Ranger balanced somewhat awkwardly between them, occasionally raising his head to catch the wind in his face. As they navigated the rough forest trails, Rebecca found herself mentally rehearsing what she would tell the authorities. She needed them to believe her, to understand the calculated malice behind Mark's actions. They stopped briefly at a stream crossing, allowing both Rebecca and Ranger to drink and rest. Hardin seemed increasingly impressed by the German Shepherd's discipline and intelligence. "These military dogs are something else," he commented, watching Ranger scan their surroundings. "They train them for everything. Detection, protection, tracking. Costs upwards of $50,000 to train each one." Rebecca nodded, scratching behind Ranger's ears. "I've seen them work in Afghanistan. Never thought I'd owe my life to one, though." As they remounted the ATV to continue their journey, a distant sound echoed through the forest. A helicopter, its rhythmic thumping growing steadily louder. Hardin looked up, shading his eyes against the sun. "That'll be search and rescue. They must have mobilized as soon as I called it in." Relief surged through Rebecca. The nightmare was almost over. Help was coming. She would be safe soon. But as the helicopter drew nearer, passing low over the treetops about half a mile to their west, an uncomfortable thought occurred to her. If Mark had somehow managed to report her missing first, he might have already poisoned the well with his own version of events. She needed to be prepared for skepticism, for questions that might seem to doubt her account. "Ranger Hardin," she began carefully, "when we reach the station, I need you to listen to my full story before anyone else talks to me. My husband is manipulative, convincing. He might have already contacted authorities with a false narrative." Hardin studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "I've been working these woods for over 20 years, ma'am. I've seen people in all states, lost, injured, panicked. I've never seen anyone with a trained military dog voluntarily at their side who was making up stories." He gestured to Ranger, who sat alertly between them. "That dog wouldn't be with you if you weren't telling the truth. Animals know." His words provided a measure of comfort as they resumed their journey. The helicopter circled widely, its searchlight sweeping the forest canopy, before veering off toward the main ranger station where they were headed. Rebecca held onto the ATV's frame, her body aching, but her spirit strengthening with each mile that brought her closer to safety. Ranger occasionally turned to look at her, his amber eyes seeming to convey an understanding beyond what should be possible for an animal. Whatever mysterious circumstances had brought this remarkable dog into her life at her moment of greatest need, Rebecca knew with absolute certainty that their connection was far from coincidental. Something profound had aligned when her path crossed with rangers in the depths of that forest. And as the trees began to thin, revealing glimpses of a clearing ahead where the main ranger station waited, Rebecca silently promised both herself and the loyal animal beside her that this wasn't the end of their story together. It was just the beginning. The main ranger station emerged from the tree line, a substantial log building with solar panels on the roof and several vehicles parked outside, including a sheriff's department SUV and an ambulance. Rebecca's grip on the ATV's frame tightened as they approached, her mind racing with both relief and apprehension. Ranger sensed her tension, pressing closer against her leg as they slowed to a stop. "You're safe now," Ranger Hardin reassured her, cutting the engine. "These are good people." A small group hurried toward them. A uniformed sheriff's deputy, a woman in EMT gear, and another forest ranger. Rebecca dismounted stiffly from the ATV, her legs wobbling slightly after the long ride. Ranger stayed glued to her side, his posture alert but not aggressive. "This is Rebecca Winters," Hardin announced to the waiting group, "and her companion, who I believe is a military working dog." The EMT stepped forward first. "Ma'am, I'm Sarah Delgado. Would you let me check you over?" Rebecca nodded, allowing the woman to guide her toward the ambulance, Ranger following closely. As the EMT began a basic assessment, checking vital signs, examining the scratches on Rebecca's arms and face, the sheriff's deputy approached with a notepad. "Ms. Winters, I'm Deputy Collins. I understand you've been through quite an ordeal. When you're ready, I'd like to hear what happened." Rebecca took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth, when her account would either be believed or questioned. She glanced at Ranger Hardin, who gave her an encouraging nod. "My husband, Mark Winters, took me to a remote cabin for what he claimed was an anniversary trip," she began, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "Once there, he revealed he'd been planning to leave me. Not just leave, he deliberately abandoned me in the wilderness with minimal supplies, no phone, no transportation. He made it clear he expected me not to survive." Deputy Collins's expression remained professionally neutral as he took notes. "When did this occur?" "2 nights ago. The cabin was somewhere northwest of here. I don't know the exact location." "And how did you end up here?" Rebecca explained the events of the past 48 hours, Mark's return and attempted assault, her escape with the SUV, meeting Ranger, finding the abandoned hunter's cabin, and finally encountering Ranger Hardin. Throughout her account, the German Shepherd remained pressed against her side, occasionally making eye contact with the listening humans, as if confirming her story. The dog's presence seemed to lend credibility to her words. As Hardin had suggested, few would question the judgment of a highly trained military animal. "We'll need to locate this cabin," Deputy Collins said when she'd finished. "And we'll put out an APB for Mark Winters immediately." "Do you have a photo of him?" Rebecca shook her head. "My phone was destroyed, but he's 36, about 6 foot, 180 pounds, brown hair, blue eyes. He has a small scar on his left cheek from a rock climbing accident." As she provided the description, the EMT finished her examination. "You're dehydrated and exhausted, with some minor cuts and abrasions, but nothing life-threatening," she reported. "I'd recommend transport to the hospital for a more thorough evaluation, including some blood work and IV fluids." "What about Ranger?" Rebecca asked, her hand instinctively moving to the dog's head. "He stays with me." Deputy Collins and the EMT exchanged glances. "Ma'am, I'm not sure the hospital will—" "He saved my life," Rebecca interrupted firmly. "Multiple times. I'm not going anywhere without him." Ranger Hardin stepped forward. "I made some calls while we were en route. That dog is almost certainly from the Mountain Division K9 training facility, about 60 miles north. They reported a German Shepherd missing during a training exercise 3 weeks ago. I've got a contact there who's sending someone to meet us. But they confirmed the dog should stay with Ms. Winters for now, since he's bonded to her." The deputy nodded slowly. "All right. Let's get you to the hospital first. We can sort out the details there." As Rebecca was helped into the ambulance, Ranger jumped in without hesitation, positioning himself beside the gurney where he could maintain visual contact with her. The EMT raised her eyebrows but didn't object. "I've never seen a military dog attached to a stranger like this," she commented as she set up an IV line. "They're usually completely focused on their handlers." Rebecca watched Ranger settle into a vigilant posture at her side. "Maybe he sensed I needed him," she said softly. "Or maybe he needed someone too." The ambulance doors closed and they began the journey to the nearest hospital, about 40 minutes away in the small town of Pinecrest. As they traveled, Rebecca felt the accumulated tension of the past days beginning to ease slightly. She wasn't safe yet, not with Mark still out there somewhere, but she had escaped the wilderness, had found help, and most miraculously, had found Ranger. At the hospital, the staff initially balked at allowing a dog into the emergency department, but a combination of Deputy Collins's authority and Ranger's impeccable behavior eventually won them over. The German Shepherd sat quietly beside Rebecca's bed as doctors examined her more thoroughly, drawing blood and administering fluids to address her dehydration. "Your body has been through significant stress," the attending physician told her, reviewing her test results. "But you're in remarkably good condition considering what you experienced. We'd like to keep you overnight for observation and to continue hydration." Rebecca agreed, though she insisted on arrangements for Ranger to remain with her. The hospital staff eventually converted a small storage area adjacent to her room into a makeshift space for the dog, complete with water and blankets brought by a sympathetic nurse who owned German Shepherds herself. As evening fell, Deputy Collins returned with news. "We found the cabin you described," he reported, standing in the doorway of Rebecca's hospital room. "There's evidence supporting your account, signs of a struggle, your damaged phone outside, even the message you left at the hunter's cabin. We've issued an arrest warrant for Mark Winters on charges of attempted murder and domestic assault." Relief flooded through Rebecca. They believed her. They were looking for Mark. Justice might actually be possible. "There's something else," the deputy continued, his expression grave. "When our team searched the rental cabin more thoroughly, they found something disturbing hidden under a loose floorboard. A life insurance policy in your name, taken out 6 months ago. The beneficiary is Mark Winters. The payout is $2 million. Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. He planned this that far in advance. It appears so. And there's more. Bank records show he's been systematically emptying your joint accounts over the past month. Classic preparations for disappearing. The full extent of Mark's betrayal hit Rebecca with fresh force. This hadn't been a spontaneous act of cruelty. It had been a calculated plan months in the making. He had kissed her good morning, shared meals with her, slept beside her, all while plotting her death. "We'll find him," Deputy Collins assured her, seeing her distress. "Every law enforcement agency in the region has his description. He won't get far." After the deputy left, Rebecca lay back against the hospital pillows, trying to process everything. Ranger, sensing her emotional turmoil, moved closer to the bed, resting his chin on the mattress beside her hand. She stroked his fur absently, finding comfort in the steady warmth of his presence. "What happens to you now?" she murmured to the dog. "Will they take you back to the training facility?" As if in answer to her question, a soft knock sounded at the door. A man in military fatigues stood in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped dark hair and the unmistakable bearing of a soldier. "Ms. Winters?" he asked, his voice deep but gentle. "I'm Sergeant Michael Hayes from the Mountain, Division K9 training facility. I understand you found one of our missing trainees." Ranger's reaction was immediate and surprising. He rose to his feet, ears perked forward, but didn't rush to the visitor, as Rebecca might have expected if this was his handler. Instead, he maintained his position beside her bed, regarding the sergeant with what almost looked like cautious assessment. "Please come in," Rebecca said, struggling to sit up straighter. "And yes, this is Ranger. At least, that's what his collar says. He found me in the forest after my husband." Her voice trailed off, the words still difficult to speak aloud. Sergeant Hayes nodded, stepping into the room but keeping a respectful distance. "The sheriff's department briefed me on your situation. I'm very sorry for what you've endured." His gaze shifted to Ranger, his expression softening. "We've been searching for this guy for 3 weeks. His real name is Echo. He was in our advanced training program when he disappeared during a wilderness navigation exercise." "Echo," Rebecca repeated, looking at the German shepherd with new understanding. The name suited him, a reflection, a response, a presence that came back when called upon. "He saved my life, multiple times." The sergeant smiled slightly. "That doesn't surprise me. He was one of our most promising trainees, exceptional scent detection, navigation skills, and protective instincts. What's unusual is how he's bonded with you. These dogs are typically very handler-focused." Rebecca continued stroking Echo's fur, noticing how he leaned into her touch while still watching the sergeant. "Maybe he recognized that I was military. And too, I served as an army nurse, 2 tours in Afghanistan." "That could be part of it," Hayes acknowledged. "These dogs are trained to recognize uniforms and military bearing, though you weren't in uniform." He studied the German shepherd thoughtfully. "There's something else at work here. Something we don't fully understand about canine psychology and their ability to sense human needs." A silence fell over the room as both humans watched Echo, who had settled again but remained alert, his eyes moving periodically between Rebecca and the sergeant as if following their conversation. "What happens now?" Rebecca finally asked, the question she'd been dreading. "Will you take him back to the training facility?" Sergeant Hayes considered her for a long moment before responding. "Eventually, yes. He represents a significant investment in specialized training, and he's destined for deployment with our forces." He paused, noting Rebecca's downcast expression. "However, there are protocols for situations like this. Echo needs to be evaluated by our veterinary team and possibly undergo some retraining after his time in the wild. That process could take several weeks." He took a step closer, his voice softening. "During that time, there's no reason you couldn't visit him, and given the exceptional circumstances, the bond that's clearly formed between you, there might be other options to consider down the road." Rebecca looked up, hope flickering. "What kind of options?" "In rare cases, working dogs who form unexpected bonds or who demonstrate unique capabilities in specific environments can be redirected to specialized roles. Sometimes that includes civilian partnership placements, particularly with veterans." He raised a hand cautiously. "I can't make any promises. It would involve evaluations, approvals from higher up, but it's not impossible." The possibility, however remote, sent a surge of emotion through Rebecca. The thought of losing Echo after everything they'd been through was unbearable. He had become more than a temporary companion. He represented survival, trust, hope in the darkest of circumstances. "When would you need to take him?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Not immediately," Sergeant Hayes assured her. "Given your medical situation and the ongoing investigation, I think it makes sense for Echo to remain with you for at least a few more days. That will give us time to prepare for his return and evaluation." He paused, then added, "And it will give you both time to heal." Relief washed over Rebecca. A few more days wasn't long, but it was something. Time to process her ordeal, to testify against Mark when he was found, to begin rebuilding her shattered sense of security, and to be with the remarkable animal who had changed everything. As if understanding exactly what was being discussed, Echo moved closer to Rebecca, resting his head on the bed beside her arm in a gesture that spoke volumes. The sergeant watched this interaction with evident interest. "I've worked with military dogs for over a decade," he said quietly. "What you two have found is special. Whatever happens, don't lose sight of that." After the sergeant left, promising to return in a few days, Rebecca sank back against her pillows, exhaustion finally overtaking her. The hospital room was quiet, except for the soft beeping of monitoring equipment and Echo's steady breathing beside her. For the first time since Mark had revealed his true nature in that remote cabin, she felt truly safe. As sleep began to claim her, Rebecca's hand remained resting on Echo's head, their unlikely partnership a beacon of light in the darkness she had endured. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, the ongoing search for Mark, the uncertainty of Echo's future, her own recovery, she would face them with the same determination that had carried her through the wilderness. And she would never again underestimate the extraordinary capacity of an animal to understand exactly what a human heart needs in its most desperate hour. Morning sunshine streamed through the hospital window, casting a warm glow across Rebecca's room. She had slept deeply for the first time in days. The combination of exhaustion, security, and medication drawing her into a dreamless slumber. As consciousness returned, her hand immediately reached down to find Echo, the German shepherd who had become her guardian. He was there, alert as always, his amber eyes meeting hers, with that uncanny intelligence. When he saw she was awake, his tail thumped gently against the floor, a subtle greeting that somehow conveyed both vigilance and affection. "Good morning to you too," Rebecca murmured, her voice stronger than it had been the previous day. The IV fluids had done their work, restoring her hydration and helping her body begin the recovery process. A nurse entered, smiling when she saw Rebecca awake. "Your vital signs look much better today," she said, checking the monitors. "And your furry friend has been the perfect patient. He wouldn't even leave your side when we offered to take him." Outside, one of the orderlies had to bring food and water in here for him. Rebecca wasn't surprised. Echo's protective instinct seemed unwavering, as if he had appointed himself her personal guardian. "Has there been any news?" she asked, trying to sit up. "About my husband?" The nurse's expression sobered. "The sheriff's deputy is here to see you when you're ready. He asked me to let him know when you woke up." Rebecca nodded, mentally preparing herself. "I'm ready now." While the nurse went to notify Deputy Collins, Rebecca used the bathroom and washed her face, trying to feel more human. The hospital had provided clean clothes, simple sweatpants, and a t-shirt donated by staff, which felt luxurious after days in the same dirt-covered outfit. Deputy Collins arrived as she was finishing a light breakfast, Echo still stationed faithfully by her side. The officer's expression was carefully neutral, but Rebecca detected something in his demeanor that set her on edge. "Ms. Winters," he greeted her, taking the chair beside her bed. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Better," she replied, setting aside her half-eaten toast. "What's happening with the search for Mark?" The deputy glanced down at his notepad, then back at her. "We've had a development. Mark Winters was located last night at a motel about 70 miles from here." Rebecca's heart rate spiked, the monitor beside her bed betraying her sudden anxiety. Echo immediately sensed the change, rising to his feet with heightened alertness. "You've arrested him?" she asked, her voice tight. Deputy Collins's hesitation told her everything before he even spoke. "Ms. Winters, I'm afraid the situation is complicated. Your husband has made some counter-allegations." A cold weight settled in Rebecca's stomach. "What kind of counter-allegations?" "He claims you've been struggling with PTSD from your military service, that you became paranoid during your camping trip, accused him of trying to harm you, and fled into the woods despite his attempts to stop you. He says he's been searching for you desperately ever since." Rebecca stared at the deputy in disbelief, anger rising in her chest. "That's absurd. There's evidence, the life insurance policy, the cabin, my phone that he destroyed. We're investigating all of that," Deputy Collins assured her. "But he has explanations for those elements too. He claims the life insurance was standard financial planning that you both agreed to. He says your phone was damaged when you threw it during what he describes as a PTSD episode. And he insists he left supplies at the cabin, expecting you would return there after you." "Calm down." The calculated nature of Mark's lies left Rebecca momentarily speechless. He was spinning her military service against her, using her time in a war zone to paint her as unstable, unreliable. It was a particularly cruel twist of the knife, weaponizing the very service she was proud of. Echo pressed closer to her, his warm weight against her leg, providing an anchor as fury and disbelief threatened to overwhelm her. The German shepherd's unwavering presence seemed to remind her that the truth would eventually prevail. "Deputy," she said finally, fighting to keep her voice level, "I was not having a PTSD episode. I've never had one. My military records will show that I completed both my tours without psychological incident and that I've never sought treatment for combat-related trauma." She took a deep breath. "Mark deliberately abandoned me in that forest. He took my supplies, destroyed my phone, and when he returned, he had a knife. He intended to kill me." The deputy nodded, making notes. "The knife is an important detail. We haven't located any weapon at the cabin." "Because I took it," Rebecca explained. "When Echo, Ranger, attacked him, Mark dropped it. I grabbed it when we fled. It should still be in my backpack." This new information seemed to shift something in the deputy's assessment. "Where is your backpack now?" "The EMTs took it when I was admitted. It should be with my belongings." Deputy Collins excused himself to locate the backpack, returning several minutes later with the dirt-stained pack. Under Rebecca's direction, he found the hunting knife secured in an interior pocket, carefully wrapped in a torn piece of cloth to protect the blade from damaging the fabric. The deputy examined the knife, his expression thoughtful. "This is consistent with the type of weapon someone would bring for a camping trip, but it also supports your account of the confrontation." He looked up at Rebecca. "Would you be willing to provide fingerprint samples? If your husband's prints are on this knife but he's denying having it, that would be significant." "Of course," Rebecca agreed immediately. "Whatever you need." As Deputy Collins bagged the knife as evidence, Rebecca realized something. "Deputy, there's another witness. Ranger Hardin. He found me in the forest with Echo. He saw my condition, heard my account when it was fresh. We've already taken his." Statement, the deputy confirmed. He's been quite adamant about the state you were in when he found you, and his assessment of the military dog's behavior towards you. He glanced at Echo, who maintained his protective posture beside Rebecca's bed. The dog's behavior is actually one of the more compelling elements in this case. Rebecca frowned. What do you mean? Military working dogs like this one are extensively trained to assess threats and human intentions. They don't form attachments easily, especially to strangers. The fact that this dog not only helped you, but has remained protective of you speaks volumes. It's not evidence we can present in court exactly, but it certainly influences how we're approaching the investigation. For the first time since the deputy had arrived with news of Mark's counter-allegations, Rebecca felt a flicker of hope. Echo's presence wasn't just providing her emotional comfort, it was lending credibility to her account in ways she hadn't anticipated. What happens now? She asked. Mark Winters has been brought in for questioning. He's not under arrest yet, but he's a person of interest in an attempted murder investigation. We've seized his phone and are obtaining warrants for his financial records and electronic communications. The deputy's expression hardened slightly. If what you've told us is accurate, and I believe it is, the evidence will bear it out. After Deputy Collins left, Rebecca sank back against her pillows, emotionally drained by the conversation. Echo rested his head on the edge of her bed, his eyes fixed on her face with an expression that seemed almost concerned. He won't get away. With this, she told the dog, scratching behind his ears, the truth will come out. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Sergeant Hayes stood in the doorway, this time in civilian clothes, rather than his military fatigues. May I come in? I heard there were developments in your case. Rebecca nodded, gesturing to the chair the deputy had vacated. As Hayes entered, Echo acknowledged him with an alert glance, but remained positioned by Rebecca's side. News travels fast in a small town, Hayes said, by way of explanation, especially when it involves a military working dog and a case this unusual. Mark is trying to claim I had a PTSD episode, Rebecca told him, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. That I imagined the whole thing. Hayes's expression darkened. Using your service against you, that's low. He studied Echo for a moment, then looked back at Rebecca. You know, there might be a way that Echo could help establish the truth. Rebecca straightened, interested. How? Working dogs like Echo are trained to track and follow specific scent trails. If Mark was at that cabin, if he traveled through the forest looking for you, as he claims, Echo might be able to verify those movements, or prove they never happened. Hope flared in Rebecca's chest. Is that admissible in an investigation? Military working dogs' tracking abilities are considered reliable enough for military operations and have been used in civilian law enforcement. It wouldn't be conclusive on its own, but combined with other evidence, Hayes shrugged, it could help build the case. Rebecca leaned forward eagerly. How soon could we try this? I'd need to clear it with both the Canine Facility Command and the Sheriff's Department, Hayes cautioned. And you'd need medical clearance to return to the site. He assessed her condition. How are you feeling, truthfully? Much better, Rebecca insisted. The doctor mentioned possibly releasing me today if my labs continue to improve. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. I'll make some calls. See what I can arrange. In the meantime, rest and recover. That's an order, soldier. His use of military terminology brought a small smile to Rebecca's face. There was something comforting about the familiarity of it, a reminder of a time when her role and responsibilities had been clear, when she had been part of something larger than herself. After Hayes left, a doctor came to examine Rebecca, pronounced her recovery remarkable considering the circumstances, and agreed to discharge her that afternoon. The hospital staff helped arrange temporary accommodations at a local motel that accepted dogs, paid for by a victims' assistance fund. As Rebecca gathered her few belongings, preparing to leave the hospital, her phone rang, a temporary device provided by the sheriff's department so she could be reached during the investigation. Deputy Collins was calling with an update. "Ms. Winters, we've found something significant," he said without preamble. Mark's phone records show he researched wilderness survival rates and how long can someone survive without water in the weeks before your trip. He also made 3 calls to your life insurance company, and there's a text exchange with an unknown number discussing making it look like an accident. Relief flooded through Rebecca. "So, you believe me. You know he planned this." "The evidence is mounting," the deputy confirmed, "but Mark is sticking to his story, and he's retained an attorney. This will likely go to trial if he doesn't confess." "What about the knife?" Rebecca asked. "Preliminary fingerprint analysis shows both your prints and his on the handle, which is consistent with both versions of events. We're continuing to process other evidence from the cabin." After ending the call, Rebecca sat on the edge of the hospital bed, processing this new information. The digital trail Mark had left would help substantiate her account, but the case wasn't airtight. Without her testimony and supporting evidence, Mark's carefully constructed alternate narrative might create enough reasonable doubt to escape conviction. Echo nudged her hand gently, his warm presence grounding her spiraling thoughts. Rebecca scratched under his chin, grateful beyond words for his steady companionship. "We'll get through this," she told him softly, "one step at a time." That evening, settled in the modest motel room with Echo lying vigilantly near the door, Rebecca allowed herself to truly contemplate the future for the first time since her ordeal began. The immediate danger had passed, but the road ahead was uncertain. There would be interviews, evidence collection, possibly a trial. Her marriage was over, shattered beyond any possibility of repair. Her sense of trust had been profoundly damaged, and at some point, Echo would return to his training facility, continuing the military career he had been prepared for. The thought of losing the German Shepherd created an ache in her chest that surprised her with its intensity. In just a few days, this remarkable animal had become more than a rescuer or companion. He represented everything she had lost and everything she hoped to reclaim: loyalty, protection, unconditional support. A text message from Sergeant Hayes interrupted her ruminations. "Tracking exercise approved for tomorrow morning if you're feeling up to it. Sheriff's Department on board. We'll pick you up at 800. Rebecca texted back her confirmation, a surge of determination replacing her earlier melancholy. Tomorrow would be another step toward justice, another opportunity to establish the truth of what had happened in that forest. Echo raised his head, watching her with those intelligent eyes that seemed to perceive far more than an animal should. Rebecca smiled at him, the first genuine smile since this nightmare began. "We're going back to the forest tomorrow," she told him, "to help prove what really happened. The German shepherd's ears perked forward at her words, his posture somehow conveying both understanding and readiness. Whatever challenges awaited them in the coming days, Rebecca knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would face them with this extraordinary animal by her side, their unlikely bond a testament to the powerful connection that can form between human and canine in the most desperate of circumstances, and somewhere in that realization was the first fragile seed of healing. The trial lasted 2 weeks, with Mark ultimately convicted of attempted murder. As he was led away in handcuffs, Rebecca felt not victory, but closure, the final chapter of a nightmare ending at last. 6 months later, Rebecca stood at the edge of the forest where her ordeal had begun, Echo by her side. Now a certified therapy team. They visited veterans struggling with trauma, Echo's extraordinary intuition helping others as it had once helped her. She placed her hand on Echo's head, feeling the steady warmth beneath her fingers. "Ready, partner?" Echo looked up. Amber, eyes reflecting unwavering loyalty. Together, they stepped into the trees, not with fear, but with confidence. The wilderness that had nearly claimed her life had also given her its greatest gift, a bond that transcended words, forged in desperation but flowering in healing. As Rebecca followed the trail deeper into the forest, Echo trotting faithfully beside her, she knew with absolute certainty that sometimes our greatest salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, and sometimes, when betrayed by those we trust most, we find true loyalty in eyes that never learned to lie. If you found this story of survival and extraordinary friendship inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more incredible true stories to life. What animal do you think shows the greatest loyalty? Let us know in the comments below.